Welcome to Friends and Fiction. 4 New York Times bestselling authors, endless stories. Novelists Mary Kay Andrews, Kristin Harmel, Kristy Woodson Harvey, and Patti Callahan Henry are 4 longtime friends with more than 70 published books between them. Together, they host Friends and Fiction, with author interviews and fascinating insider talk about publishing and writing, to highlight and support independent bookstores. They discuss the books they've written, the books they're reading now, and the art of storytelling. If you love books and you're curious about the writing world, you're in the right place. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Friends and Fiction Show. I am Kristin Harmel.
And I'm Ron Block.
And this is Friends and Fiction, 4 New York Times bestselling authors, endless stories to support indie bookstores, authors, and librarians. And of course, we have the world's best librarian, Ron Block, with us today. So how lucky are we? On this week's show, the fabulous Ron and I are thrilled to welcome author Allison Pataki to discuss her new novel, Finding Margaret Fuller. The book was just released earlier this month, and we are so excited to speak with I almost called her Margaret. I'm already running the two of them together. We're excited to speak with Allison about Margaret.
That's right. But first, we have just a quick reminder to check out all the fun things going on in our Friends and Fiction community at friendsandfiction.com. There you'll find our show schedule, details on upcoming in-person events, and links to our bookshop.org page. And it's the Friends and Fiction official book club with Brenda and Lisa joining us as well. Also to our merch store, our book subscription box, and our weekly email newsletter sign-up. In other words, if you want to know more about anything Friends and Fiction offers, and we offer a lot, be sure to check out friendsandfiction.com.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, now let's get to our friend Allison.
Yes. Allison is the New York Times bestselling author of several novels, including The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post and The Queen's Fortune, as well as the nonfiction memoir Beauty in the Broken Places and 2 children's books, Nellie Takes New York and Poppy Takes Paris. Allison's novels have been translated into more than 20 languages, and she's a former news writer and producer. She's also written for the New York Times, ABC News, The Huffington Post, USA Today, Fox News, and other outlets. My question is, when does she sleep?
Wait, exactly, that's right. Allison graduated from Yale University with a major in English and spent several years in journalism, just like I did, before switching to writing fiction. A member of the Historical Novel Society, Allison lives in New York with her husband and family. Sean, can you bring Allison on?
Hello.
Hi, Allison, welcome.
Allison, channeling Margaret so thoroughly that you're getting Margaret vibes, right? I have become my character.
Exactly. I mean, that's when you know you're doing it right. When there's just no difference between the two anymore. Exactly.
Just all melded together.
Hearing
the voices in my head. That's a good sign.
It is a good sign.
Man, Allison, I just turned in a draft of a book, and all I have had in for the last few days are voices in my head. So I completely get it.
Yes. I once noticed myself rushing home from the subway to get back, and I needed to just dump out what was coming into me. And I found myself walking really upright because I was afraid if I tipped my head, it would fall out. Like that was how precarious it felt. And I was like, wait, just stay there for 1 minute until I can get to my computer.
Isn't that crazy? I know exactly what you're saying. And I think to anybody who that hasn't happened to, who doesn't write books, we probably sound like crazy people.
Totally crazy people.
And part of the success of the book, though, is I have to tell you that as I was reading it, I was imagining Margaret's voice in my head. So it went from you to me, and I had this lilt and this kind of little accent and things that I was reading the entire book in my head in.
I'm thrilled.
An accent. Ron, you should ask the questions today in an accent. I feel like that would help things along. But okay, Allison, let's get started. I had a chance to read Finding Margaret Fuller for a blurb all the way back in August, and I loved it so much. And I know I'm not alone because it was recently named the PBS Readers Club book for the month of March too, which is very exciting. So congratulations on that. I am thrilled, as I imagine you are, that this book is finally out in the world.
Yes.
And I am really happy that Ron and I are getting to speak with you about it during Women's History Month. Because Margaret Fuller was such a trailblazer for all of us. And yet I think her name has largely been lost to history. Can you begin today by telling us a little bit about this extraordinary woman and what made you decide to tell her story?
Absolutely. I would love to. Well, so yes, Margaret Fuller had this larger than life, epic life story, and her legacy has roots into so much of what we as women and just individuals, how we live our lives today. But as you said, her name is not as well known as it should be. So how I stumbled upon her. 3 years ago, I had just had a baby, and my mother-in-law and some family had flown from various parts of the country to come visit. And it was Memorial Day weekend. We had all these plans, and it rained all weekend. And we did absolutely nothing. We couldn't even go outside. So kind of getting cabin fever by probably like day 2 or day 3, my mother-in-law passed me a book. And it was this book called American Bloomsbury. And it was about this genius cluster in Concord, Massachusetts during the 19th century that was Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Louisa May Alcott, Henry David Thoreau, and others. And just the names that you really think of as the titans of American letters and literature. And at the center of this cast of characters, about the people about whom which I felt like I knew a good amount. You know, I'd certainly read their work in high school and college and beyond. But the center of this was Margaret Fuller, this fascinating, bold, disruptive, kind of charismatic and larger-than-life leading lady, whom Ralph Waldo Emerson referred to as the radiant genius and fiery heart at the center of their clique. And so she literally jumped off the page for me as an historical figure. And I thought, that's the one I want to know about. And how do I not know more about her? And so I felt very fortunate that she's not as well known in the popular imagination because she just had her hooks in me. And I said, that is the next book. That's my next leading lady.
That's fascinating too. And I'm so glad that you did, because I'd heard the name also before, and there was so much about her that I didn't know. And reading your book just really just kind of got me all excited about knowing more about her. So when it comes to writing biographical fiction, I always wonder how an author decides, like, at what point in their life to start the story arc. How did you decide that for her and at that moment? Because it really does, it felt right at the right time and felt effortless and exactly right.
Oh, that's such a great question. And it's different with every female heroine, right? Yes. So with Margaret, she was an extraordinary individual. Her whole life, she was raised in a time where women were not offered the same rights to education, to having careers or professions outside of the home as men were. But her father raised her as a boy and was really exacting and severe in saying she was going to be educated like a boy. And she was a brilliant child. She was speaking like fluent Greek and Latin by the age of 5. And so she had this trajectory. She was like a rocket ship. But it really takes off for her, I think, in sort of this transition from being a private genius individual to being a public facing sort of leader in society and leader for women's rights movements. And when she eventually goes off and like lives this global dramatic life, it really begins when she plugs in to Emerson and Thoreau and the Alcotts and the crew that are all living together in Concord. Because while we know their names and we know their books like The Scarlet Letter and Walden Pond, Walden, what many people don't know is that they were living together, this crew of thinkers. They were, you had Emerson with his handyman living up the stairs who was Thoreau, with the Alcotts as the neighbors down at the street in one direction and the Hawthornes in the other direction. And what people don't know is that there were really juicy stories behind the stories. And so when Margaret goes to Concord, she accepts the invitation to live in the Emerson home and begin to think and write and spar with these people. That for me is when her life as an adult and as a thinker and like a pace setter really begins. And then it just goes off from there. But so for really, it's when she accepts the summons from Ralph Waldo Emerson and is finally among her intellectual peers. And things begin to get a little juicy and dramatic at that point.
Yes, they do. Okay, so on Friends in Fiction, and you may know this already, but we like to ask what a book is really about at its core.
Yeah.
What would you say that is for Finding
Yeah.
Margaret Fuller?
It is Finding Margaret Fuller is about a brilliant, brazen, bold woman who looked at the world as it was and felt this incredible inner drive and compulsion to change it, to improve it, to move humanity forward for women, for all people, and had the brilliance, the talent, the relationships, the gumption, the grit, the resilience to actually really do big, powerful, meaningful, inspirational things. So you have Margaret Fuller as the woman who was the inspiration for Hester Prynne, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. You have her walking the shores of Walden Pond with Thoreau as he's considering moving out there. But then she goes on to do really incredible things in New York City when she accepts the summons from Horace Greeley to become a female correspondent. And then she moves to Europe and, takes off even more, gets very, very dramatic from there. But so it's this leading lady who was the founding mother by so many accounts, by really what people say of her is the founding mother of the American women's rights movement.
Yes.
And it's really a beautiful, bold life, and one that deserves to be pulled from the footnotes of history. And we see Margaret taking center stage as the leading lady she was.
And she absolutely deserves to do so. I mean, her story is so incredible. And like you, Allison, I write historical fiction. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something really powerful about finding these stories from the past that still somehow feel very current and very relevant, even though they took place many years ago. I felt like that when I was reading this book. It is very much of its time, but you could imagine her showing up here in 2024 and being completely at home and completely at ease. It's
absolutely,
and also needed.
For sure. Needed.
Like she's needed.
And
yeah.
She was about a century ahead of her time in what she was
really
saying.
was.
And she was the first woman permitted to study at Harvard. And one of her founding or her seminal books was Woman in the 19th Century. And that is considered the founding document of the women's rights movements because she grapples with many messy themes and topics and questions of her time. But one of the things she's saying is there should be no such thing as a male education, a male career trajectory, and a female education and a female trajectory. She said, let women pursue what they feel called to pursue. She said, let them be sea captains if that be their calling. That was a novel, radical idea. But it's still, as you said, so relevant, so timely, and she would still have a lot of people that she could give a talking to if she were alive today. It would be fascinating to see what she would get up to if she had all of the right.
You are absolutely right. Yeah, that's a good point. So you touched on the people who form some of the earlier years of her public life, such as Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, people like that. And I was really struck in reading this book by how very real and well-rounded those characters seemed on the page. So they all play big roles. It wasn't like they were people that you mentioned in the background who were just a part of her life. Like we really get to see them interacting with her and being a part of her life and shaping her. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you brought these legends so alive on the page? And I think along with that, I'm also wondering whether that was an intimidating thing to undertake.
It was so intimidating and so humbling. One of Margaret's peers said, I could read Hegel in the original German, Dante in the original Italian, but I still can't. I'm still working on Margaret Fuller in the original. Their minds were just on this level where, yes, it was absolutely daunting and intimidating, but also I'm trying to tell this story for the writer or the reader of 2024. And so, as Ron said, he might have heard the character with this strange lilting accent that they probably had. But I'm also trying to bring the readers in today in a way that's educational and entertaining, and hopefully an immersive narrative experience. But what I had two huge things going for me. Number one, I went there. I always have to start the research process by entering as fully as I can into the world of the heroine and the leading lady, and to walk the trails that she walked with Emerson and Thoreau and Louisa May Alcott, and to see the bedroom, the red bedroom that, was Margaret's room right next to Emerson's study, that created some tension in the household for Mrs. Emerson, who was upstairs with Thoreau. And I had to just soak up the context and the details, and to see, okay, this is where Louisa May Alcott was living, just up the street, when she changed the name of her character, the eldest sister, Anna, which is what it was in real life, to Margaret, to name her after her mentor, Margaret Fuller. And, this is where the Hawthornes were as newlyweds. And so I went to Concord first, and they came to life for me in that space. And there's really always a part in the process, as you know, of historical fiction where you've input as much historical data as you can. And then at a certain point, your character sort of springs to life and sort of takes over from there. And you've got the historical woman as the bones of the story, but now she has flesh, and she's breathing, and she's talking to you. And so that really happened for me in part because of the research. And then the second huge thing I had going for me is they were all such prolific writers and prolific letter writers. And this was the age before text messaging or email. So we have the documentation of what they said to one another. And, you can read the letter where Hawthorne is saying that Emerson thinks Margaret's like the greatest woman alive and the one woman in the world worth considering. And you have Margaret, in her own words, explaining how confused she is by some of these dynamics that are happening between her and, the quip she makes that she has to leave Concord because it's lacking in discord, and she wants like a grittier existence. So you begin to hear their voices, and particularly Margaret's voice. And so that really allowed these characters to come to life for me. And then, you're always doing research as you go to fill things in. But that big research push up front really kind of gives me all the ingredients I need to then go get to work.
Well, you put those ingredients to use just wonderfully. I mean, I really felt such a deep sense of all of those characters on the page, which I think is anyone, for somebody who loves books, this book is a feast. I mean, it has all of your, I mean, really, it has all of these writers who we feel like we know through their work, but maybe we don't know as well behind the scenes. And in putting them in motion against Margaret, you've given us an insight into their lives too, which I think is really cool. I also wanted to touch briefly on something else you mentioned, which was Margaret being the inspiration for Hawthorne's Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter. Can you talk briefly about that? That just kind of, when I read that, it tickled me. I just thought that was a really neat thing.
Right? Because we all read The Scarlet Letter how many times, over the course of our education. We all know, we can all picture the bold, brazen brunette woman sitting in the forest, letting her hair down and sort of just embracing her power. And so when Nathaniel Hawthorne's wife, Sophia, read the final manuscript of The Scarlet Letter for the first time, she took to bed with a headache for the rest of the day because she knew that it wasn't about her. And she knew it was about the woman living up the street with whom her husband was having this wild flirtation. And so Margaret was always kind of, I think, yearning for a larger canvas, yearning for an even greater sort of field in which she could just grow and evolve and adapt. And so she leaves Concord. She goes to New York City. She's working for Horace Greeley, making history, covering the writings of Frederick Douglass and Karl Marx and the music of Beethoven. And then Greeley gives her an even greater, more enticing more scandalous, boundary pushing offer, which is for her to go alone as a woman to Europe to serve as his first female full-time correspondent in Europe. And Margaret jumps at the opportunity. This begins this grand adventure that takes her to London, where she's hanging out with, great thinkers in London. Then she goes to Paris, where she meets Georges Sand and Frédéric Chopin. She ultimately ends up in Rome. And we think of Italy as this unified country, but in Margaret's time, Italy did not exist. Italy was the papal states and duchies and principalities. It was carved up by many different European powers. And so Margaret becomes embroiled there in what would become the Roman Revolution, which was the first real push for Italian unification. And while they're in this heady, tempestuous time, she falls in love and takes as a lover this dashing Roman count, and they're fighting in the Roman Revolution.
As one does. As one does.
Yeah.
So Nathaniel Hawthorne is writing about this bold, kind of scandalous, brunette, elusive woman who takes a lover and bears a child out of wedlock. Who's the person in his life that he's gleaning this inspiration from? Is their bold, brunette, scandalous, boundary-pushing friend who's over in... This created an international scandal when Margaret did this. She eventually ends up in Florence with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning tells her, "You created the largest international scandal since my elopement to Robert Browning." And so this was really juicy and this was dishy for the time. And Margaret always just followed her heart. And that made her so unique. And it also made her a kind of dangerous, scandalous figure in many people's eyes, as was Hester Prynne.
Yes.
Fair enough. Okay.
And that story alone should be a novel, in my opinion. I'd love to hear, I'll read more about that. Before I go on, I just want to say that I echo what Kristin said about bringing these characters to life. I never really thought much about Hawthorne as a swarthy figure, but after reading this, I kind of went and read some things, and I didn't realize he had been considered such a ladies' man and such a desirable person to have in your life.
Mm-hmm. I think some words I used was he was a cad, he was a dog, he was a rogue.
I love it.
Charmer.
All the things.
All the
things.
So you mentioned Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So in the novel, she tells Margaret that no one reads the books about the boring women who followed the rules. And I love that because it sums up this book almost perfectly. Margaret's anything but boring, and she broke nearly every rule laid out for her. And she's at the center of the transcendentalist movement. I said that right. She even made an enemy of Edgar Allan Poe, who famously said, "Humanity is divided into men, women, and Margaret Fuller." And yet somehow her legacy has largely disappeared. Hers just isn't a household name. And you talked a little bit about this earlier, like the male contemporaries. Why do you actually think that is?
I think a huge part of that is the tragedy of her own personal ending. And I'm guessing we have mixed readers here where maybe some haven't read I don't want to give away a spoiler, but it's not the ending we would have wished for her.
Right. No.
And what happened concurrently was that what many people, including Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Margaret herself, consider to be the greatest work of her life, it disappeared at the same time that Margaret perished. Yeah. And so I think that would have gone a long way toward perhaps making her a bigger household name as a writer.
Yeah.
Additionally, the other big work of her career, Woman in the 19th Century, which cemented her as one of the founding mothers of the American women's rights movements, she had been invited the summer she passed away to come back to America and serve as the president of the first meeting of the women in 1850 when they met in Worcester, Massachusetts. She was on her way back and never made it. And again, I don't want to spoil the book, but had she been at that meeting, had she survived, she was 40 years old, had she survived through what would become the next decade of social upheaval, you can only imagine how she might have been involved in the abolitionist movement in the advancement of the women's rights movement in this really tumultuous decade that leads us up to 1860 and the Civil War. So we can't know, and that's a great tragedy. But also, she was always known, and she would have said this as well, for as much writing as she did as the first female editor of the Dial newspaper, writing Summer on the Lakes, writing Woman in the 19th Century, writing the great work on the Roman Revolution. She was actually always known in her life as her greater talent, her greater gift was speaking and public debating. She was known as a better orator than writer. Her writing was considered kind of clunky and ponderous, but she, for instance, she held this series of conversations like salons where Elizabeth Cady Stanton was in attendance and Mary Greeley, like the who's who of the women of America at the time were studying under Margaret. And that was really where she liked to shine. And so I think that was possibly easier to get lost through the forward march of time, just that she was a thinker and a debater and a leader, but there's not as much of her written word preserved because of the way her life ended up. And also I think because she was a woman, you know, Emerson could charge a lot of money and make a really good living giving lectures and touring and speaking at college campuses and you know, the all sort of private clubs throughout the country. Margaret was probably a better speaker than he was, but she wasn't allowed to do that. And so that's sort of another one of the great tragedies of her life and of how her legacy has been shortchanged.
Well, it's true. And I feel like 40 years in her life is a different 40 years than 40 years in a man's life, because she had to spend so much of her time justifying why she should be listened to in the first place, right. Where during that time period, a man wouldn't have met those same obstacles, right? So like she lost probably so many years just to that, which is really a deep tragedy when you think about it.
That and the fact that she was always using her brain and her thinking and her writing to support herself and her mother and her family. Emerson had his deceased wife's fortune, so he could put out this prolific output of writing and speaking tours, but it wasn't like he was going to starve if he wasn't productive every minute of his life. Margaret always felt this need because it was it was a survival need where she always had to be working. So whether that was teaching in schools or private tutoring or serving with a family as a governess or working for newspapers, she had, you know, her thoughts and her great work, but she also had just the work to pay the bills. She called herself one of the breadwinning crowd. And so that also takes time and energy and sleep and resources. So.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
It is.
So, Allison, what do you hope will happen with her legacy and influence now that you've brought her story to the forefront where it belongs? Do you hope that this will have some change or bring about some change in the world, the way the world views Margaret Fuller?
Absolutely. One of the things I love about historical fiction, there are a lot of things, is it's a great way to bring people into the historical record in perhaps, hopefully, a way that feels accessible. And it's not a deep, dry, intimidating biography, but you can pick up a historical fiction and you can enter into the history in that way. And then hopefully that can inspire you to go on your own deep dive of history. And, you know, I hope this drives people to Concord or Rome or, you know, any other locations in the book. One of the things I love the most when someone finishes a book is I just had to go on the internet and I had to read everything I could and go down the rabbit hole and learn. I want people to be inspired by her. I want people to see what one woman can accomplish in 40 years and to then take that into their lives and think about what it is that they feel the world needs in order to be a better, more just, more fair, more open, kind place for all humans, and hopefully just get the conversation going around Margaret Fuller's name, bring her into the public imagination, and hopefully inspire young girls and hopefully inspire women and men to see what a gift her mind and her heart were.
Absolutely.
I love it. And speaking of rabbit holes, before we came on the air, I asked you about Lydian, so you gave me a great selection to go and learn more about her, because she was just one of the most compelling characters. She wasn't the major character, but she was constant through there, and just I needed to know more about her, and now I will.
Oh, I love that. Yes. So Life of Lydian. And if you go to Concord, the Emerson house is still, you can see her, chaise longue where she would recline and write letters. And you can really soak up some of the atmosphere of Lydian's life there.
That's good. Good.
That's awesome.
I love it. Okay, so let's take things a little bit broader here. Do you think that that you write about these influential women in history because you're personally interested and inspired by their stories, or does it go a step further? Do you feel like you're on a mission to restore these women to their proper places in history?
It's an obsession, I would say.
I love it.
What I say to my husband is, when I know that I've met my woman and I know that this is going to be my next book, I say, I've been bitten. I've been bitten because the story, something about it, and it's different every time. This is my 10th book. It has truly been an organic process of discovery, and it's been different every time. But something about the story just gets its hooks into me. There is always that moment where I think, how do I not know this? How did I not know this? That's a huge piece for me. And I have to be willing to basically give years of my life to learning everything I can, researching, writing, but then hopefully talking about it for the rest of my life, if readers will allow me to. I have to really be obsessed, and I am, and I love them all, and I love every woman in different ways, but there's really, I have jumped all over the place. I've been American Revolution, and then I was told after The Trader's Wife, stick with the American Revolution, find another woman. And I said, now I'm jumping to the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, World War I, different century, different woman entirely. And then, I've been in France at the time of Napoleon, and then Marjorie Merriweather Post, and now I'm Concord in the 19th century. But something that is always in common as a thread through all these women is, well, number one, their names are not as well known as they should be. And I just want to tell their story to people who I hope will be as ravenous as I am to know. But also, there was something, or many things, that just made it really hard for them. And that struggle and that friction that leads to growth and resilience and tenacity, they're all in these situations where it could have been easy. It might look easy. Margaret was not starving. Margaret, worked with enough women of her time to know what it was like to be in the slums of New York City, or, some of the women in Europe. But there, in spite of that, there's a struggle for Margaret. There's a friction. There is a need to grow, adapt, and overcome. And that is just, to me, very compelling. It's the human story. It's the heartache. It's the growth and strength and resilience and survival through the heartache. It's that tension where these women can inspire us. And I think that that's always a big piece for me. It's like, I want to know more about this woman, and I want to know how she did it, how she did what she did.
And as readers, we want to know that too.
I hope so.
That's definitely. I was going to say that I feel like in the last several years, there's just been a renaissance of these untold stories and kind of hidden stories. And Kristin does this so well, too, is getting these stories out there and making people really kind of think about them and really embrace them and kind of like rewire their thinking about history and the power, especially of women in history, and how they didn't have the voices heard for the ages, but they do now.
Yeah.
And that's another thing. And this is Kristin's work, certainly. And this is the historical fiction of, her story, this genre that we're writing in, is we're visiting moments that we feel like we know a decent amount about. These are moments that we studied in school. These are moments where huge things that have touchstones to our life, are very relevant. But we're going back in and saying, there were women there too. And not only were there women on the front lines of this, but they had active hands in shaping it, not only witnessing history, but participating in it and leading through it. And so that is also a very compelling piece for me, to go back and look at this history and re-examine it now from the perspective of the women who were there. Because as I felt with Margaret Fuller, when I went back and looked into this clique of mostly men, I thought, well, hers is actually the most interesting story of them all. And that's the one I want to know.
And the people that have the bigger voices didn't want those told. They wanted to tell their own stories and make that be the story. And there's always a missing piece in a lot of these stories. And I love that writers are now bringing that to the forefront.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that too. We're at a good moment in our own literary history, I think. Yes. You know, Allison, I was thinking as you were talking about what drives you to write about these women. You were talking about resilience and growth and tenacity and survival through the heartache. I was thinking that in a lot of ways mirrors something that happened in your own life that happened after I think you were already on this path to writing about these women. And I know the last time we had you on Friends in Fiction, we touched on Beauty in the Broken Places, which of course was your just achingly beautiful memoir about what you and your family went through when your husband had a stroke at the age of 30 while you were pregnant. I mean, I still can't wrap my head around the fact that happened to you. Can we first of all just check in now and ask how he's doing? Yes. But I also, yes, I'll ask you that first, and then I have another follow-up question about that.
Thank you. I've done so many interviews since then, but I still remember talking about it with you in particular.
Really?
Because of the warmth and the genuine, connection you all had to that. Yeah,
I'm so
absolutely.
Touched to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, just the club of the bad thing, right? And we know that it's not a good place to be, but that there is connection that comes from membership there.
Absolutely.
But so he's doing really well. He's doing great. We have 3 daughters, which keeps our life so busy and full and joyous, and thank God they're healthy girls and they're happy and boisterous and crazy, and we're having a lot of fun, and we're learning on the job every single day. But so our family is full and rich, and he's working in medical consulting, and I'm working wildly with this career in fiction, and we support one another, and we're raising these girls together. And it's really, every time, we think about it all the time. We talk about it all the time, the fact that he almost died, and the fact that he didn't, wake up, he didn't know who anyone was. And it's a really important perspective shifter and reminder every single day that just this is such a gift, and that to be able to do what we do and live together and raise our children, and just every day is a gift. And it can be hard to remember that all the time and to keep, the right perspective, but it's important to keep coming back to that. And so thank you. He's doing great. He's going to be really punching in on the clock a lot and has been this next month. His mom's going to be on book tour, and dad's going to be busy.
Oh, that's awesome. And it's great to hear you talking about that, because I feel like I had very much the same experience going through cancer a year and a half ago. It's like there's just something about coming out of the other side of something like that just teaches you to value every. I mean, I would have said that before. I would have paid lip service to that. I would have understood that. But there's something different about the way you value every single day, and your children, and the things that you have in your life, and the things that you're so blessed with. I think after you've been through a dark period.
Yeah.
And Allison, I wanted to ask you, because you were talking about how your characters were shaped by the dark times. I'm wondering how you feel that you continue to be shaped as a person, but also as a writer, because of that difficult time that you and your family went through. Has it changed the way you approach characters on the page?
Well, I know, and this is not only from Dave's experience, but from other loved ones and other life experiences. I know that there is no way to be that close to death and that close to losing a loved one or someone. There's no way to see that and experience that and go through that and not have everything about your life reframed and shaped in terms of crystallizing what actually matters in the end of all this. And then, we live in this incredibly broken world where things hurt every single day, and the people we love hurt, and things can be really good and also really hard. And you can hold both those things, and you can be feeling really good about something while somebody that you love is really going through something, and that hurts you. And so I think that it just makes me, you, all of us, as individuals, we have this enhanced or greater depth of just understanding and hopefully empathy.
Yep.
And the loneliness that you feel when you're really suffering and when you're scared and you're alone and you don't have control and you don't know what's going to happen. Once you've walked a few more steps and you've sort of been able to come out a little bit, and it's not linear, obviously, but once you have been able to put a little bit of space and perspective between yourself and the really dark, scary times, it helps you to show up for others, I think, in a way that hopefully maybe can make them feel less alone and lonely, because you know how that feels. You've been in their shoes.
Absolutely.
And that, I think, comes from friendship, from parenthood, from relationships, from any loss.
Yes.
Any time that we all have, where the rug just gets yanked out from under us so suddenly. This is my 10th book, and I can just say in 10 years of life, so much has happened of great joy and great challenge and difficulty that I think it all, as writers, we pull from all of it. I think I will pull from something that I didn't even know made an impact, that I didn't even think was a big deal like 7 years ago, but it's showing up in a piece of dialogue I'm writing. The Celia are constantly picking up all sorts of stimulation and inspiration. And so I think just a part of what we do is we feel things very deeply. And we have to, because we have to then convince readers to feel things deeply that we're trying, the experience we're trying to create for them. We have to, we enter into that. We have to live it and inhabit it and feel it. And so I think we pull from all of it, right? And it probably makes us not always the most pleasant people. I think we see things and we feel things, and then it all comes out in our work.
So you are so right. I completely agree. All right, Allison, if you would stick around, we have one more question for you at the end. But first, we just want to give a few quick reminders to our listeners and viewers out there.
Okay. For all of you watching and listening, now that you've had the pleasure of meeting Allison, we encourage you to rush out and buy your copies of Finding Margaret Fuller. The perfect place to do that is the Friends in Fiction shop on bookshop.org. You'll be getting it at a discount, helping to fund our show, all while supporting our beloved independent bookstores nationwide. We also want to remind you to follow us on Instagram and join our Facebook group, which is nearly 250,000 members strong. When you visit Friends in Fiction, you can stay abreast of upcoming Friends in Fiction guests, in-person events, shop our merch store, order your subscription box, and sign up for our weekly email newsletter, which is chock full of bonus content.
If you love the Friends in Fiction show, we hope you'll leave a rating or review, and remember to tell a friend. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can catch all of our back episodes, and you'll never miss a thing. And when you subscribe to our podcast, you can take us with you wherever you go.
Yay. Okay, real quickly, back to the two of you talking about the challenges and how it's shaped you. I'm just so inspired by that, and you should go on tour together, because I know that people are going to be so enamored with this, and they're going to relate to it, and they're going to just take so much grace and peace from it too. So I really appreciate that.
The whole conversation that we've been having with Allison today, I've been thinking, how can I figure it out so Allison and I can spend some more time together and get to be actual in real life friends? Because just everything she's saying, my heart is just saying yes, yes, yes. I feel the same. Allison, we got to take this show on the road. You and I.
That makes three of us. I agree too.
I'm in. I'll go with you. I'll cook or something. Okay. Allison.
Ron does make a mean martini.
And you're going to speak in an accent for us.
Exactly.
Well, maybe. I'll do all the voices.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's great.
Allison, we've got one more question for you. You just celebrated 10 years since the debut of your first novel, The Trader's Wife. Mm-hmm. That's a big milestone in publishing, for sure. Yeah. I'd love to ask you tonight how you think you've grown as a writer in these 10 years, and whether there's something you wish you could tell yourself 10 years ago on the cusp of publishing your first book.
Such good questions. Wow. Okay. Well, I would say, first of all, I don't think it gets easier at all. If anything, I think it gets harder. When I look back to launching The Trader's Wife, I didn't know Kristin. I didn't know any other authors. I had only worked with my one editor on my one book. I had like the blissful luck of the dumb, innocent. I knew nothing. And so I didn't even know what I didn't know. And now 10 books in, I have internalized every review, every piece of editorial feedback, the good and the bad, because the bad, obviously you internalize as like in your head, but then also the good, you're like, well, I got to live up to the expectations and I don't want to let anybody down. And so I have to have some just perspective about that, and just to you have to just acknowledge it and allow it, but not get too caught up in your head, because as writers we can get very caught up in our head. That's our job, is to get caught up in our head. Yep. But I will say I do get this panicked excitement, gratitude, feelings of being completely overwhelmed every time a book comes out, because it's like having a baby and then releasing it out into the world. And now all of a sudden it has all its own relationships with every reader who picks it up. And I'm so thankful, but it's just out there, and there's, you release all control. And so my agent told me many books ago, she said, you hit a point where you have to stop editing, because it's never going to be perfect. You have to release it at a certain point. And so, how I have grown, I just think that it's putting in the hours. The more you do something, the more you refine what you're doing, and the more you refine your craft. And the more I read, the more inspired I get to write. And the more I write, the more just, I think, tools I have to be able to continue doing what I love. It's always going to have to also come back to being totally inspired and obsessed by the subject material. And I have to have that in order to be able to write. And the advice I would give my younger self is do it. And I would really give that advice to anyone, because if you feel this primal need to create, and this, however that manifests itself, whether it's cooking or painting or singing or dancing or writing, whatever it is, then that is like not to be ignored, and that's sacred, and that is to be celebrated and pursued. And just be gentle with yourself and give yourself grace as you pursue it. Don't maybe let anyone read your first draft. My first draft is sitting there and no one's going to read it. But just give yourself the permission to do it, to pursue it, to grow, to improve. And if you feel that need to create, then you need to put the pen to the paper and begin creating, because you can't keep that in.
That's
doesn't get better than that. Thank you. So how can readers connect with you on the road and online in the coming weeks? I know the book is out a little bit, but where can they find out what's the latest?
Absolutely. So a great landing place is my website, AllisonPataki.com. And all of my social media is on there as well. But on Instagram, it's Allison Pataki. On Facebook, Allison Pataki page. I'm on X. And then all of the tour information for where I will be, I'm also sharing it on my social media. It's also in my newsletter, if you subscribe to my newsletter, at AllisonPataki.com. And I would love to hear from you. So yeah, send me a message via whatever medium you choose.
Well, and Allison, now that you and I are going to be best friends and go on a world tour together, I'm sure people can find out information on my website too. Because we'll be. I'm just kidding.
I love it. Sign me up. Can I sign up on your website?
Allison, it was such a pleasure speaking with you today. Just like last time we had you on. I am moved and just overwhelmed by your honesty, your goodness, your kindness. It shows up on the page. It shows up in speaking to you. And it's just been a pleasure. We really appreciate you being with us on Friends in Fiction.
It's been so meaningful. I love it. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, everybody. I was so thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Be sure to tune in next week for when Mary Kay and Kristin will be welcoming Lisa Scottolini to discuss her new novel, The Truth About the Devlins. That show will air on the Friends in Fiction Facebook page and YouTube channel on Wednesday, April 3rd at 7 p.m. And it will be posted to our podcast for your listening pleasure on Friday, April 5th.
Thank you so much to all of you out there for being with us. We will see you next time. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in. You can join us every week on Facebook or YouTube, where our live show airs on Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, subscribe to our podcast and follow us on Instagram. We're so glad you're here.